Max Carter had always preferred the shadows. The quiet hum of his ship as it coasted through the cold vacuum of space, the distant stars that flickered like pinpricks in the void. Everything about the darkness spoke to him, resonated with a part of him that refused to leave the past behind. He had seen too much, lost too much. The galaxy was a broken thing, a sprawling system of wars, lies, and betrayals. He knew it better than anyone else. But even in the emptiness, something tugged at him now. The message came in the dead of night, its transmission cutting through the static like a knife. Max had been in a routine, just another job on a forgotten world, a quick and easy gig for a contractor who paid well but never asked questions. He had expected to sleep through the rest of the journey, to let the autopilot do the work while he shut down for a few hours. But the message found him. Help us. The words were simple, but the voice, that voice, it was sharp, desperate, alien, yet human in its plea. An unmistakable desperation, the kind of cry that reached through the void and demanded attention. It wasn't a distress beacon. It wasn't a distress call. It was something worse. Someone needed him. He was the one they'd turned to. Max Carter, I know you're out there. The voice cracked, broken but determined. We're in a city, a place you wouldn't believe. They won't let us go. Please. We need you. The transmission ended abruptly, cutting off before the sender could provide more. Max stared at the screen for a long moment, the words hanging in the air like a scent too foul to ignore. It wasn't the first time someone had reached out to him, but it was the first time he felt something stir inside him, a tight, gnawing feeling that he hadn't experienced in years. He'd stopped being a hero long ago. He wasn't a man who believed in causes anymore. After the war, after the betrayals, the lost comrades, and the shattered promises, there was nothing left to fight for. Nothing except the next payday, the next job. But something about this, it felt different. Max leaned back in his chair, fingers hovering over the console, torn between shutting the message down and following through. The transmission had been encrypted, buried deep in layers of code, which only made the situation more suspicious. The city they spoke of, a hidden underground place, was a location that didn't appear on any official records, not in any of the military databases, not in any of the galactic archives. It was, as far as the galaxy was concerned, a non-existent place. What the hell had he just heard? Max ran his hand through his unkempt hair, glancing around the cockpit of his small ship, the Raptor. There were no more targets, no more contracts waiting to be filled, just endless miles of nothing. And yet, as he stared at the blinking signal, he could hear something else in the back of his mind, the echo of his own conscience. He hadn't believed in that voice in years, not since the war. He had been a soldier back then, fighting for a cause that seemed right until it didn't. A soldier who believed in a galaxy that could be fixed. But the truth was, the galaxy had no intention of fixing itself. It was a place of cruelty and injustice, and Max had long ago learned to stop caring about the people who got caught in its gears. But these women, if they were real, were caught in something far worse than war, something darker, a city underground, a place where they were sold, where their identities were erased. Slavery wasn't just a thing of the past in this galaxy. It was thriving in the shadows, in places like this hidden city. Max glanced at the map on his console, zooming in on the coordinates that had been embedded in the message. His mind churned through possibilities. Could this be a trap? Could he afford to walk away? The image of the voice, its raw, desperate tone, kept flashing behind his eyes. They were trapped. They needed him. Without thinking, he started typing in the coordinates. His fingers moved with an ease that came from years of muscle memory, from years of navigating the murky, dangerous underworlds of the galaxy. He couldn't stop now, even if he wanted to. The message had already found him. There was no turning back. His ship surged forward, its engines coming to life with a low hum that vibrated through the hull. He set a course for the unknown. The coordinates were far out in the fringes of known space, on the edge of nowhere, a place few would dare venture. Max leaned back in his seat, eyes narrowing. The quiet of space pressed in on him, the stars outside turning into streaks of light as he punched the hyperdrive, pushing the Raptor toward its destination. He felt the familiar, almost soothing tension of the jump, the way his pulse matched the rhythm of the ship. But this time something was different. This time the galaxy would make him answer for what he had left behind. As the stars warped around him, Max's mind was filled with flashes of images, fleeting glimpses of alien faces, of women caught in chains. They weren't supposed to be like that. No one should have to live like that. He'd seen enough death, enough corruption. He'd seen what war did to people, what it did to men and women alike. But slavery? Enslaving others for profit? That was a cruelty Max couldn't ignore, not now. The ship lurched as it passed through the threshold, jumping through the deep folds of space. His course was set, but his heart wasn't so sure. Was he walking into the jaws of a trap? Or was he walking into the heart of something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined? He would find out soon enough. The stars outside flickered, growing dimmer as his ship entered the uncharted zone. He stared ahead, his eyes steely, his expression unreadable. There were no answers yet, only questions, and the weight of a mission that had already begun to feel too big for one man. But that was never Max's style. When it came to a fight, the only thing that mattered was surviving long enough to finish it. Max's ship descended through layers of atmosphere, cutting through a hazy cloud cover that clung to the planet's surface like a shroud. He was close now, too close to turn back. The planet's name was Varanath, at least that's what the star charts called it, though it wasn't exactly a place that drew attention. A dead rock on the edge of known space. No habitable colonies, no lucrative mining prospects, just the kind of forgotten world that the galaxy liked to ignore. Max had learned to appreciate such places. It was the perfect kind of anonymity for someone who had long since grown tired of being seen. The underground city, however, was anything but forgotten. It was hidden, tucked deep beneath the planet's surface, a place buried in secrecy, its existence known only to a select few who controlled the dark trade that flourished in its depths. Max wasn't sure how deep the lies ran, but as he saw the stark landscape below him, jagged mountains, barren wastelands, the occasional flicker of mining lights in the distance, he knew the city itself was something far worse than an abandoned relic. He'd seen places like this before, places where the law didn't reach, and where the lawless had made their own rules. It'll be a trap, he reminded himself as he adjusted the controls, but it's too late now. The landing pad was little more than a rusted-out platform, nestled at the base of a cliff that stretched impossibly high into the smog-choked sky. As his ship touched down with a heavy thud, Max scanned the horizon. There was no welcoming committee, no sign of anyone, just the weight of silence pressing down on him. For a moment, he simply sat there, letting the airlock hiss open. The ship's low hum was the only sound as he swung his legs over the edge of his seat and stood. His mind was already running through the contingencies, escape routes, ambush points, traps. It was instinct. He was never truly off the clock, never truly alone. Max grabbed his blaster and slipped it into his holster, his hand grazing the cold metal of his combat knife. He took a breath, steadying himself. A piece of him, small but persistent, wondered what he was walking into. Who were these women? What did they know? Why him? But as the airlock opened fully, a gust of cool, metallic-scented wind washed over him, pushing those questions aside for now. He stepped onto the landing pad. The city's entrance wasn't far, just a narrow alleyway that led into the dark mouth of a cavern-like structure. A flickering neon sign hung above it, its letters too faded to make out. It wasn't the kind of place you would enter without a reason. But Max wasn't a tourist, and he wasn't here to make friends. As he moved deeper into the alley, the streets began to reveal themselves, narrow and labyrinthine, choked with the stench of oil, sweat, and burnt-out machinery. There were people here, or something like people moving in and out of the shadows. Some were hunched low, their faces obscured by masks or scarves, while others glanced over their shoulders with eyes full of fear or malice. The city had a pulse, thick and jittery, like the hum of a hive. This was a place of transactions, not kindness. Max's boots clacked against the concrete as he walked, his gaze flicking over the faint outline of crumbling buildings, their walls slick with grime and age. As he approached a street corner, he heard the low murmur of voices. It wasn't the kind of conversation you overheard by accident. These people weren't speaking freely. They were whispering, speaking in hushed tones, their words clipped and tight. "Careful, friend." The voice was rough, barely a whisper in the air, but it stopped Max in his tracks. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, wiry man dressed in tattered rags, his face obscured by a hood. The only thing that shone in the dim light were his eyes, sharp, calculating. "You don't know what you're walking into." Max's hand drifted to the hilt of his blaster. "I'm looking for someone," he said flatly, his voice low, measured. He wasn't going to give away too much. Not yet. The man's lips curled into a knowing smile. "I figured you'd be here for that. You're not the first, you know. There've been others, looking to free them." He leaned closer, his breath sour with something bitter. "You've heard the stories, haven't you? The women, they're nothing but commodities here. Bought, sold, traded, used for whatever sick purpose the slavers want." Max didn't respond immediately. His gaze flicked over the man's ragged clothes and wild eyes. The desperation was obvious, but Max knew better than to assume everyone in a place like this was simply a victim. There were people who played both sides in situations like this, people who profited from the misery of others. The man chuckled darkly. "What makes you think you can get away with it? No one makes it out of here alive. The city's got its claws in deep, my friend. The slavers are protected. You fight them. You're signing your death warrant." Max's hand tightened around his blaster. "I didn't come here for a fight. I came here to get someone out." The man's smile faltered, but he nodded once, his expression turning serious. "You won't get far then, but there's someone who might help you. Not many trust them, but you might want to look for the Red Lantern." Max raised an eyebrow. "The Red Lantern?" "A bar." The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "They run it out of the old quarter. You'll find what you're looking for there if you're brave enough." Max nodded curtly. He didn't need more explanation. The Red Lantern. It was a lead, and leads were worth something in a city like this. He didn't question the stranger further. There was no time for that. He turned and started walking, heading toward the crumbling district the man had mentioned. As he walked, the weight of the city began to settle around him. There were eyes everywhere. The streets were narrow, the walls close, pressing in on him. Every corner felt like a trap. Every person could be an enemy, a spy, or someone looking to sell him out. But Max had lived through worse. It wasn't until he reached the old quarter that the true scale of the city began to sink in. Here, the streets were darker still, the buildings towering over him like ancient monuments, their windows boarded up or broken. The air was thick with smoke, the murmur of distant laughter and heated arguments swirling in the alleyways. He could feel the weight of it, the despair of a city forgotten by the galaxy, left to rot beneath the surface. The Red Lantern wasn't hard to find. Its neon sign flickered weakly in the dim light, half the letters missing, but Max could read it clearly enough. He pushed through the door, the creaking hinges protesting against the weight of the world outside. The inside was dim, the smoke thick, and the low hum of conversation and clinking glasses created a palpable sense of tension. No one here looked up at him. No one cared. But Max did notice something that made his pulse quicken. There, in the corner, sat a group of women. Their eyes were tired, hollow, but there was something in them, a spark. He wasn't sure if it was hope or just sheer survival, but it caught his attention. They weren't just patrons, they were different. And as Max made his way to the bar, he knew one thing for sure. This place, this city, was nothing like anything he'd imagined. Max sat at the bar of the Red Lantern, his back against the rough-hewn wood, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. The women in the corner hadn't moved since he'd entered, their eyes fixed on the floor, their shoulders tense as though they could feel the weight of his gaze. There was something unsettling about them, something in the way they held themselves. It wasn't just the weariness in their eyes, it was the silence that clung to them like a second skin. Max had been around long enough to recognize fear when he saw it, but this wasn't just fear. It was something deeper. Resignation. A surrender to the system they'd been caught in, as if their spirits had been broken long before their bodies had been sold. He ran his fingers over the edge of his glass, the cool surface grounding him in the present. The bartender, a grizzled man with a scarred face and dull, disinterested eyes, watched him with a wariness that told Max more than any words could. In a place like this, trust was earned in blood, not conversation. Every drink, every glance, every movement was calculated. Max's thoughts were interrupted when a figure slid into the seat next to him. He hadn't noticed her approach, which was more than a little concerning. The woman was tall, her frame draped in tattered clothing that spoke of hardship, but not defeat. Her face was angular with sharp features that could have been beautiful once, before the weight of this hellhole had worn her down. Her eyes were wide, dark, and intelligent, yet shadowed by something he couldn't quite place. "I'm surprised they let you in," she said, her voice low and husky. She wasn't looking at him, but at the women in the corner. "Most don't get past the front door." Max took a slow sip from his glass. "I'm not most people." She didn't reply right away, but he could feel her gaze lingering on him now. She was studying him, appraising him like a piece of meat in a butcher's shop. But there was something else, curiosity maybe, or something darker. "Looking for someone?" she asked, turning to face him fully now. Max hesitated. This was the moment where everything could fall apart. He had a job to do, and the fewer people who knew about it, the better. He wasn't here to make friends, but he wasn't blind either. Something about her presence screamed caution. Still, he couldn't afford to ignore every potential ally in a place like this. "A few someones," he said carefully. "A group of women. They were taken from their home worlds, sold to slavers." He kept his tone level, casual, though inside his heart was already racing. He hadn't expected this conversation to go so smoothly. She studied him for a long moment before leaning in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the story, isn't it?" She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes flicking toward the women again. "Slavers, trafficking, all the usual. You want to save them? You're going to have to do more than just ask questions, friend." Max's hand tightened around his glass. "I don't have time for games. Where are they?" Her lips curled into a half smile, though there was no humor in it. "You don't understand, do you? You think this is about saving a few people, but this place, this city, it's not built on saving, it's built on taking. Everything here has a price. Your life, their lives. Freedom doesn't come cheap." She stood, pushing her seat back with a scrape. "You want to get them out? You'll need help, real help. And you'll need to be prepared to pay for it." Max frowned, but before he could respond, the woman was gone, slipping back into the shadows of the room like smoke. He watched her disappear, then turned back to the bartender, whose bored gaze never left him. Max hadn't planned on asking anyone for help. He wasn't here to make deals, but the woman's words lingered in the air like a warning bell, impossible to ignore. There was something larger happening in this city, something that Max had yet to grasp fully. The stakes were rising, and with them, the cost of failure. Max pushed the empty glass aside, stood up and walked toward the exit. He had no more time to waste. If he was going to get these women out of here, he needed to move fast. The city's streets seemed darker now, the oppressive air pressing in on him like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching. His boots echoed off the cracked concrete as he made his way toward the old quarter. the faint smell of burning fuel and sweat lingering in the air. The alleyways were thicker here, winding in on themselves like a maze. There was something wrong about the place, something in the way the walls closed in around him, narrowing the path ahead. Max had been in dangerous territories before, but this felt different. He wasn't alone. The feeling prickled at the back of his neck, and Max knew better than to ignore it. Someone was following him. He didn't have to turn around to know it. He could hear the faint footfalls, the barely perceptible shuffle of movement behind him. They were too careful, too practiced. Someone who knew how to tail a person without being detected. Max picked up his pace, quickening his steps, weaving through the narrow passages. The footfalls followed, closer now. He didn't dare glance back. In a city like this, it could be anyone. Someone who was paid to follow, someone trying to eliminate threats, or maybe even someone looking to sell him out. Max couldn't risk the wrong move, not now, not with everything on the line. He turned a corner sharply, then slid into an alcove, pressing his back against the stone. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped altogether. Max held his breath, his hand on the blaster at his side, ready. And then, nothing. Max cursed under his breath. He had lost them. Or had they lost him? Either way, the game had changed. Someone had just put him on their radar, and that meant he was running out of time. The deeper he ventured into the city, the clearer it became that the stakes were more than just a rescue mission. The system that controlled this place was vast, its tendrils reaching into every corner of the galaxy. If he was going to succeed, if he was going to survive, he had to learn the rules of this city. And fast. But as he moved deeper into the shadows, he realized something. The walls of this city were not just stone. They were a reflection of something much older, something that had been here long before him, and if he wasn't careful, they might swallow him whole. Max's hand tightened on his blaster. He was in this now, whether he wanted to be or not. Max had grown used to the pulse of the city, the subtle rhythm of danger that thrummed beneath the surface of every alleyway, every shadow. He had learned to trust his instincts, to feel the tremors of movement before it happened, to anticipate danger before it was upon him. But even the sharpest instincts could be deceived. The red lantern was behind him now, and the city was closing in around him. The narrow streets wound deeper into the dark heart of the underworld, where secrets were bartered like gold and lives were as expendable as scrap metal. Max's boots struck the cracked pavement with an even beat, his breath steady but quickening. He wasn't alone anymore. Not long after leaving the bar, the feeling of being followed had returned, only this time it was heavier. There was no sound, just a thick, almost suffocating pressure that pressed on him from all sides. It was as if the city itself had turned its gaze upon him, its eyes lurking in every corner, its breath hot on his neck. Max knew what it was like to be hunted, to feel the eyes of enemies on him. But this was different. This wasn't just a man with a knife in the shadows. This was something else, something systemic. Max turned another corner, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his blaster. There were still no signs of anyone, still no footsteps. But he could feel them. He could feel the threat closing in. When he reached the next junction, a small rusted door appeared on his left, half hidden by vines and crumbling walls. He hesitated. It looked unremarkable, a simple door like any other in this part of the city. But there was something in the way it stood, something that felt wrong. Max didn't believe in coincidences. The twist in his gut told him that if he didn't open that door now, he might never get the chance again. So, he did. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a dimly lit corridor beyond. The air was thick with the scent of dust, old machinery, and something else. Something metallic. Something sharp. Max moved forward, his senses on high alert, his body tensed like a coiled spring. The hallway stretched out before him, silent but oppressive, as if the walls themselves were watching. He moved cautiously, his hand brushing against the cold metal of the wall as he walked. The corridor seemed endless, each step taking him deeper into the bowels of the city. Then, as he passed a narrow side passage, a faint noise caught his attention. A voice. Low, hurried, frantic. Max stopped, listening. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was in trouble. Without thinking, he followed the sound. He turned into the side passage and nearly stumbled over a pile of scrap metal. As he pushed it aside, he came upon a small room, barely large enough to be called a storage space. In the corner, a woman was kneeling on the floor, her hands bound behind her back, her head tilted toward the ground. She was dressed in tattered clothes, her skin pale, her body gaunt from hunger and fatigue. Max's heart skipped a beat. It was her, the woman from the bar, the one who had warned him. He moved quickly, his footsteps silent as he approached. He crouched beside her, his fingers working on the binds around her wrists. "Shh," he whispered, glancing around nervously. "You're safe now. I'm getting you out of here." The woman's eyes flickered open, and she blinked, her gaze bleary and unfocused. But as her eyes locked on Max, something in her expression shifted. The terror faded, replaced by something else. Recognition. "I told you to leave, didn't I?" she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes were wide now, frantic. "You don't understand. You don't—" Before she could finish, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, steady and deliberate. Max's head snapped up. He didn't have time to finish the job. "Get out of here," he hissed, shoving the woman toward the narrow opening behind him. "Go. Now." But she didn't move. Her body trembled, her face contorted with fear. "You don't know what you're doing. You don't know who they are." Max felt his pulse quicken, a warning ringing in his head. Something wasn't right. He glanced over his shoulder. The footsteps were closer now. Too close. Before he could react, the door to the small room slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. The figure standing in the doorway was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that made the air around him grow colder. Max recognized him instantly. "Captain Rask," Max muttered under his breath, cursing the day he'd stepped foot on this hellhole of a planet. The man was a legend in these parts, and not the kind you wanted to be on the wrong side of. He was part of the underground city's twisted infrastructure, one of the enforcers of the slaver syndicates that ruled this place. Dangerous, unrelenting, and ruthless. Max had heard of him in passing during his time in the military. Stories of his brutality had circled through the ranks like whispers in the dark. Rask's eyes flicked from Max to the woman, and then back to Max. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I thought I'd find you here." Max's hand instinctively moved to his blaster, but before he could draw it, Rask's men were already in the room, 2 of them. The woman let out a strangled gasp as they grabbed her, dragging her away from Max. He lunged forward, but one of the enforcers slammed a rifle butt into his chest, knocking the wind out of him. "Bad move, mercenary," Rask said, his voice cold as ice. "This isn't a place for men like you to play hero." Max struggled to catch his breath, his vision blurring slightly. He couldn't afford to be distracted. He couldn't afford to lose his edge. As Rask's men held him down, Max's mind raced. The woman, the one who had warned him, was no longer an ally. She was a pawn, and he, like an idiot, had walked right into their trap. Rask stepped forward, looming over him. "You thought you could just waltz in here and free a few slaves, huh? You thought you could play the knight in shining armor and save the day?" His eyes gleamed with something darker. "This city doesn't work like that. No one gets to play hero here, not even you." Max's stomach twisted as Rask's words sank in. He hadn't just been caught in a trap. He had been led into it. And the woman? She hadn't been trying to warn him. She had been playing him from the start. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't here to rescue anyone. He was here to be sacrificed, a pawn in a game he hadn't even known existed. And the stakes? They were far higher than he'd ever imagined. Max's mind was spinning, the words of Captain Rask ringing in his ears like the echo of a death knell. The trap had snapped shut, and he was caught, struggling to breathe in the suffocating grip of his failure. The enforcers were still holding him, their hands like iron shackles around his wrists, pinning him to the cold stone floor. The woman, the one he had tried so hard to save, was gone. Gone, just like that. Rask's men weren't just enforcing the law. They were the law, and in a place like this, law was nothing more than a cruel joke. Max had walked straight into their hands, and the woman had led him here with her false promises. He should have known better. He had known better, but desperation had clouded his judgment. And now, the consequences of his actions were closing in fast. Rask stood over him, his boot planted firmly on Max's chest, grinding down with the weight of authority. There was no mercy in the man's gaze, just a cold, calculating satisfaction that made Max's blood run cold. "You know, you really are an idiot," Rask said, his voice low, tinged with amusement. "We don't just run these slaver rings, Carter. We own them. The whole damn underground. This city, this world, it all belongs to people like me. And you? You're just another lost soul who thought he could burn everything to the ground and walk away unscathed." Max gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay calm. His eyes were trained on the two enforcers holding him, calculating, searching for any opening, any chance to break free. But he knew the truth. There was no escape. Not yet. Not while they were so close. But that didn't mean he was out of options. "You don't get it, do you?" Rask continued, pacing in front of him like a predator circling its prey. "This isn't some heroic fantasy you've cooked up. It's a system that's been in place for centuries. You can't just tear it down by playing the lone hero. The people you think you're saving, they're already gone, all of them. They don't matter, they never did." Max's heart thudded painfully in his chest. The words hit harder than any punch. Rask was right. This wasn't a simple mission of saving a few women from a few bad men. This was something much larger, something far more dangerous, and he had walked right into the middle of it. "Get up," Rask commanded, his voice suddenly sharper, more insistent. "It's time for you to meet your new owner." Max's pulse quickened, the world narrowing as panic started to rise within him. His mind raced, but there were no clear answers, no simple solutions. He couldn't fight his way out of this. He couldn't escape. But there was something he could do, something that would give him a chance. He just had to be smart. He forced his body to relax, letting the tension bleed out of his muscles, and then, with a sudden explosive movement, he lashed out. His foot slammed into the knee of the enforcer on his left, the sound of bone cracking sharp in the silence. The man yelped in pain, stumbling back, momentarily thrown off balance. Max didn't wait. He kicked out again, this time striking the other enforcer in the gut, knocking the wind out of him. With a growl of effort, Max threw his body forward, rolling out of the way of Rask's next blow. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain that radiated through his ribs from the earlier blow. The room had gone silent for a moment, the tension hanging thick in the air. Max's heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding his veins, but his mind was calm. Focused. This wasn't a fight for survival. Not yet. It was a fight for control. If he could maintain the upper hand, he could still turn this around. He could still make something of this mission. Rask glared at him, his eyes narrowing with sudden, lethal intent. "You really think you can escape this, don't you?" he spat, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. "You've made a mistake, and now you'll pay for it." Max straightened, drawing his blaster with a practiced motion. "I'm not here to fight you, Rask," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm here to take down your whole operation." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment Rask said nothing. He just stared, as though evaluating Max like a puzzle that needed to be solved. Then, without warning, he burst out laughing, the sound dark and mocking. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" Rask shook his head, his amusement fading into something darker. "You've made your choice. But there's no turning back now, Carter. The moment you stepped foot into my city, you sealed your fate." Max didn't flinch. "Then I guess it's time to face the consequences." Before Rask could make a move, Max was already moving, slipping into the shadows, using the chaos of the moment to his advantage. The blast from his weapon rang out, disorienting Rask's men, and for just a fraction of a second, Max was free. But the freedom was fleeting. As he made his way toward the exit, his mind raced. There was more at play here than he could have ever predicted. The woman had led him into this. Yes, but she hadn't been the only one. Rask's words were still echoing in his mind. The whole damn underground, this city, it all belongs to people like me. The realization hit him like a slap. This wasn't just a fight for a few lives. It was a war against a system that had been built over centuries. The people he had been trying to save were part of that system. They were trapped in it, just like the rest of the galaxy. And Max, he had become a tool, a pawn in a game far larger than he had ever understood. And the stakes? They were higher than they had ever been. Max had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. The cost of failure wasn't just his life. It was the lives of everyone caught in the web of the underground, everyone who had ever been enslaved, exploited, and abandoned. As he slipped into the shadows, Max knew that he was no longer just a mercenary. He wasn't even a soldier. He was something else entirely, and whatever it took, he was going to burn this whole system to the ground, even if it meant tearing himself apart in the process. But first, he had to survive. Max's grip tightened on his blaster, and he stepped forward, deeper into the belly of the beast. The real fight had just begun. The heart of the underground city was a labyrinth of shifting shadows, concrete veins that pulsed with the murmur of power, greed, and fear. Max's boots echoed in the empty corridors, a solitary sound in a place where silence was the currency of survival. It had been days since he had escaped the clutches of Rask's enforcers, and now every step he took felt like a descent deeper into the belly of the beast. He had already lost so much: his faith, his safety, his sense of who he was. The only thing he had left was the women he'd promised to rescue, and the knowledge that if he didn't stop this, no one would. The map Rask's men had once taunted him with was now nothing more than a distant memory, a half-faded blueprint he clung to with desperate hope. The answers had been so close before, just beyond the horizon of his reach. But each wrong turn in the maze of the city's underworld was a painful reminder of the growing weight of the stakes, and every shadow seemed to carry a threat, as if the walls themselves were conspiring to bury him alive. And yet, there was a flicker of hope that burned brighter than all the darkness surrounding him. Kira. Her image haunted him, a reminder of why he had started this war in the first place. The woman who had once led him astray now felt like a ghost he could never forget. She was the key to everything, the whisper of a possibility, a chance to finally confront the man behind it all, Captain Rask. Max reached the narrow corridor that led into the heart of the slaver's stronghold. His body was a ticking clock, the strain of endless fighting starting to catch up with him. The physical toll had become almost unbearable, but he kept moving. The mission, his mission, wasn't about him anymore. It was about them, about Kira and every other woman who had been enslaved. He had come this far. He would not let it end in failure. As Max neared the entrance to the central chamber, the air seemed to grow colder. There was no turning back now. He could hear the low hum of machinery, the thrum of unseen engines, all churning away like some foul heart beneath the city. The chamber ahead was a pulsating nerve center of the entire operation, where slaves were sold, trafficked, and discarded like objects to be forgotten. His plan was simple, but it was also the most dangerous thing he'd ever attempted. Max took a steadying breath, forcing his racing heart to slow, and stepped through the threshold, into the heart of the slaver's empire. What he found there was worse than he could have imagined. Kira was there, but she wasn't alone. She was standing beside Rask, her eyes downcast, a slave in every sense of the word. The sight of her nearly stopped Max in his tracks. She was alive, yes, but it was not the reunion he had imagined. Her face was pale, drawn with exhaustion and defeat. The fire in her eyes, the one that had once burned with a quiet defiance, was gone, extinguished under the weight of the years she'd spent trapped in this hell. She was no longer the woman who had once contacted him, begging for his help. She was something else now. Something broken. Max. The whisper of his name from Kira's lips was barely audible, but it cut through the noise of the room like a knife. He turned to face her, his heart seizing at the sight. She had been waiting for him to save her, for him to redeem everything. But the truth hung heavy between them. This was a war that couldn't be won by a single man, no matter how noble his intentions. This was not a fight that could be solved with a blaster or by pulling a trigger. This was a battle for the soul of an entire galaxy, for everything that had been lost in the shadows. Max's hand shook as he raised his blaster, taking aim at Rask. There were no more words between them, only action, only the cold, brutal reality of the moment. The moment the trigger was pulled, everything would change. But then Kira's voice broke through the tension, her words striking Max like a bullet. "Don't!" The single word shattered him, the sound like glass breaking in his chest. Kira's voice was so weak, so resigned, that it was as though the last ember of hope she'd been holding onto had finally been snuffed out. "Kira, what are you—" "Don't," she repeated louder this time, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "It's too late. It's all too late." Max's mind reeled. He had been ready to end this, to strike down Rask, to destroy the whole corrupt system. But standing before him now was the woman he had sworn to protect, and she was telling him to stop. "Please," Kira whispered, her voice breaking. "I never asked you to save me. I asked you to save them. All of them. All the women trapped here." The words hit Max like a physical blow. All this time, he had thought he was rescuing Kira, thinking he could bring her to freedom, that she would be the symbol of all that was worth saving. But in truth, Kira had already been lost long before he had ever set foot in the underground city. The system that had enslaved her had already destroyed the woman he had known, and the woman standing before him was a shadow of that past. "Max, listen to me," Kira continued, her voice barely a whisper now. "You can't fight this war alone. It's too big, too entrenched. But you can burn it to the ground. You can take everything they've built and watch it fall. Don't let them win, not now. Not after everything we've lost." Max stood there, his blaster lowered, the weight of her words pressing on his chest like an anchor. The city around them seemed to fade away as he absorbed the full gravity of the situation. There was no going back. The choice was no longer about saving one woman. It was about saving them all, every last one. Max turned his gaze to Rask, his hand tightening around the blaster once more. The final confrontation was upon them. There were no more questions, no more doubts. It was time to end this. The shot rang out, loud and final, echoing through the chamber as Rask fell to the ground, his reign of terror brought to an abrupt end. But even as he lay there, blood pooling around him, Max knew that the battle was far from over. The city would burn, the system would collapse, but it would take more than just one man to bring about true freedom. It would take everything. Max turned to Kira, her face tear-streaked but resolute. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out to her. "Let's finish this," he said softly, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. Together, they would fight for the future. Together, they would bring this city down. And for the first time in a long while, Max felt something inside him that he hadn't thought he'd ever feel again. Hope. The city was nothing like it had been before. The air hummed with the aftershock of the battle, the echo of gunfire and the collapse of power. But amidst the rubble and smoke, there was a quiet stillness, a fragile peace that clung to the shattered streets like a dream barely holding on. Max stood in the center of the square, his boots grinding into the dirt, and watched as the remnants of the once imposing city crumbled around him. The weight of the world, the weight of countless years of suffering and injustice, seemed to press down on his shoulders, and yet there was a sense of finality, of something irreversibly different. The underground city had burned. The black market was in ruins. The slavers, once untouchable, were scattered, hiding in the corners of the galaxy or taken by the vengeful arms of the oppressed. There were no celebrations, no cheers from the people. They had known too much fear, too much loss, to ever truly believe in something as simple as hope. But even in their silence, something had shifted. It was no longer a place of enslavement. The darkness that had once ruled their lives had been broken, and now they had a chance, a fragile, fleeting chance, for something better. Max had been part of the storm, the catalyst for change, but the storm had also changed him. The journey that had begun with a single reluctant decision had ended in more than a victory over Rask. It had ended in the destruction of a system that had enslaved entire worlds. It had ended in redemption, not for him, not for Kira, but for those who had never had a voice. The women he had fought to free had all scattered, each of them uncertain of what their future would hold. For some, the only real freedom they could hope for was anonymity, disappearing into the fabric of the galaxy and starting anew. For others, there was no escaping the memories of what they had endured. Kira had been one of them. The fire that had once burned in her eyes had dimmed in the aftermath. She had survived, but the cost had been high. The woman he had known, the one who had once reached out to him for help, had faded away, leaving only a shell that wore her name. But Max had understood. He had come to realize that sometimes saving someone meant letting them go, giving them the space to heal, even if that meant losing them in the process. Now, standing amidst the ruins, Max found himself alone, the faces of those who had fought beside him fading into the distance. The freedom they had won was real, but it was still a fragile thing. The galaxy was vast, and the chains of oppression were long. The system had been broken, but not yet rebuilt. There was still so much left to do, so many more battles to fight. Max turned away from the city, his gaze drawn to the horizon. The stars were still out there, waiting, each one a distant promise of something more. The life he had left behind, the quiet life he had once thought he wanted, no longer seemed so appealing. It wasn't enough anymore. Not after everything he had seen, everything he had done. The scars of the past would never truly fade, but they no longer defined him. He had crossed a line in his own soul, one that had once seemed insurmountable. He had become something different in the process. The mercenary, the soldier who had long ago abandoned any sense of duty, was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned the cost of freedom, the price of redemption. The world, the galaxy, had lost so much, but in the ashes of the past, there was the faintest glimmer of a new beginning. He turned back toward the wreckage of the city. The women, those he had saved, those who had fallen into the same dark fate he had tried to rescue them from, were beginning to emerge. They stepped out into the daylight, their faces unsure, uncertain of the world they now inhabited, but for the first time they could breathe. They could live without fear of the slaver's hands, without the shadows that had kept them bound for so long. Kira was among them, but she did not come to him. She never would again. She had made her peace, and now it was his turn to make his own. Max walked forward, the weight of the past settling into his bones. He didn't need to say goodbye to the city, to the memories, or to the ghosts that haunted him. He had done what he came for. The journey had been long and painful, but it was finally over. He would move forward, whatever that meant. The streets of the underground city were empty now, save for the few who remained to rebuild. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden light over the ruins as the people began to rebuild their lives. There was no grand victory, no triumphant moment of heroism. There was only the quiet reality of change, the slow, painstaking work of tearing down a system and putting something better in its place. Max didn't know what came next. He didn't know if there was a place for someone like him in this new world. He didn't know if there was anything left for him to give or if he could ever truly atone for the things he had done. But as he walked away from the city, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. It was fragile, as delicate as the new beginnings of the women who had escaped the chains of the past. But it was there, nonetheless. For the first time in a long while, Max Carter had hope. And as he disappeared into the horizon, the sound of distant engines, of a new uncertain future, faded behind him.